The diagnosis that shattered the world. The city was alive with its usual rhythm. The honking of cars, the echo of hurried footsteps, and the glow of skyscrapers rising into the gray morning sky. But for Ethan Cole, none of it mattered anymore. He sat in the small, sterile consultation room of St. Raphael's Medical Center, his heartbeat echoing louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Just 3 years earlier, he had been celebrated as one of the youngest innovators in biomedical engineering, the man who had designed the neural chip that restored mobility to thousands of paralyzed patients. He was a visionary, a man whose name had filled magazine covers and whose speeches were quoted in universities. Yet at that very moment, sitting across from Dr. Meredith Lane, all the applause, all the awards, and all the fortune felt meaningless. His world had suddenly collapsed into the sound of a single sentence. "Ethan, the cancer has spread to your brain. It's inoperable." For a long moment, the words didn't make sense. They drifted through his mind like smoke, intangible and cruelly slow to settle. The air felt heavy, too thick to breathe, and the walls seemed to close in around him. He had read about moments like this, people describing how time froze, how their mind replayed everything they had done wrong, everything they had not yet done, but reality was harsher. He didn't feel the slow-motion clarity people wrote about. He felt suffocated, trapped in a room that had suddenly become a coffin. Dr. Lane's voice softened as she continued explaining treatment options, experimental therapies, and the statistics that sounded more like verdicts than hopes. Ethan heard the words months, unresponsive, and pain management, but they dissolved into a blur. His hands clenched into fists on his knees. He had spent his entire life fighting limits, building machines to outsmart nature, solving problems others said were impossible, and yet here he was, facing the one enemy he couldn't negotiate with. When he finally stood, he didn't even remember thanking the doctor. The hallways of the hospital stretched endlessly ahead of him, pale and cold, as if the entire building had been drained of color. He passed by laughing families, newborn babies, and elderly patients in wheelchairs, each one a reminder that life went on, mercilessly, indifferently. Outside, the sunlight stabbed his eyes, and the noise of the city felt alien. He walked without direction, his thoughts spiraling, his phone buzzing incessantly in his pocket with messages from his assistant, his investors and his PR team demanding updates about his upcoming project launch. He ignored them all. For the first time in his life, he wanted silence. That evening, Ethan found himself sitting alone in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the glittering towers beyond, but the view that once symbolized triumph now felt hollow. He looked around at the life he had built, the sleek furniture, the polished awards, the cold perfection of success, and felt an ache deeper than fear. What was it all for? Who would remember him when he was gone? Not the investors who toasted his victories, not the admirers who praised him online. The people he had loved, his parents, his younger brother, were gone. His friendships had withered over the years under the weight of ambition. And then there was her, Lila Hayes, the only person who had ever seen through his walls. He hadn't spoken to Lila in nearly 7 years, not since their friendship fractured under the pressure of his meteoric rise. They had grown up in the same small coastal town of Brenton Bay, where her family owned a small art studio and his father ran a modest repair shop before his death. Lila had been his anchor during his restless teenage years, the quiet, intuitive girl who always carried a sketchbook, who believed in his impossible dreams even when he didn't. She had a gentleness that steadied his chaos, and though she had once confessed her love for him before he left for MIT, Ethan had responded with silence. He had chosen ambition over affection, logic over emotion. When he made his first million, he had tried to convince himself that success would fill the void she left behind. But sitting in that empty apartment, facing the reality of his mortality, her name returned to him like a prayer whispered in the dark. Hours passed as Ethan sat there, the glow of the city flickering against his face. Finally, he picked up his phone. His hand trembled as he searched her name. The contact photo was gone. She must have changed numbers, but he found her through a local art website. where her name appeared beneath a collection of breathtaking paintings. The bio was short and unpretentious. Lila Hayes, painter, dreamer, believer in second chances. The words made his chest tighten. Without thinking, he typed an email. It wasn't poetic, not even well-structured, just raw. Lila, it's Ethan. I know it's been years, and I probably don't deserve to ask you this, but I'd like to see you one last time. I'm not well. I just need to remember who I used to be, even for a moment. He hovered over the send button for a long time before pressing it. Then he leaned back and closed his eyes, unsure whether he was hoping she would reply or praying that she wouldn't. 2 days passed without a response. He spent them wandering the streets like a ghost, visiting places he used to love but could no longer feel connected to. On the 3rd day, as he sat in a cafe near Central Park, a familiar voice broke through his fog. "You always did drink your coffee black," it said softly. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. When he turned, his heart stuttered. There she was, Lila, standing by his table, wearing a simple white dress and a faded denim jacket, her long chestnut hair loosely tied back, her eyes exactly as he remembered, warm, steady, and impossibly kind. For a second, Ethan thought he was hallucinating. "Lila?" he whispered, standing up. She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "You didn't think I'd ignore you completely, did you?" The sound of her voice hit him harder than the diagnosis. It carried the same calm melody that used to soothe him during long nights of studying, back when they would sit on her porch drinking cheap coffee and dreaming about the future. Ethan wanted to speak, to apologize, to say 1,000 things, but no words came. Lila took a deep breath and gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit. You look like you haven't slept in days." He obeyed, almost mechanically, his heart pounding. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the cafe filled the silence between them, the sound of steaming milk, laughter from nearby tables, the clinking of cups. Then Lila said gently, "You said you weren't well." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word. Ethan nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I have a tumor," he said quietly. "Inoperable. They gave me months. Maybe less." The simplicity of the statement made it even more brutal. Lila's hand, resting on the table, clenched instinctively. She didn't speak for a moment. Her throat worked as she swallowed back tears. When she finally did, her voice was steady. "You're still you, Ethan. That means you haven't lost yet." He let out a humorless laugh. "You always say things like that, as if faith could bend science." "Not faith," she replied. "Love and memory. They do things science can't explain." Her words struck him deeply. He remembered how she used to talk about art, that the truest masterpieces weren't painted with brushes, but with the emotions people left on each other's souls. And now, seeing her across from him, Ethan realized she had never stopped believing in beauty, even when the world gave her every reason not to. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about nothing and everything, about their childhood, about the bookstore she used to work at, about his company and how it had consumed him. Lila didn't ask for details about his illness. She didn't pity him. Instead, she treated him like the boy he had once been, the one who used to help her carry art supplies and steal cookies from her mother's kitchen. The simplicity of it broke him in ways medicine never could. When she finally stood to leave, Ethan panicked slightly, afraid that this fragile reconnection would vanish as quickly as it appeared. "Lila," he said, standing too, Would you come by sometime? I'd like to see your paintings." She hesitated for a moment, studying his face, then smiled faintly. "Tomorrow evening. I'll bring some sketches, but on one condition: you eat something. You look like you're fading." That night, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling, for the first time not haunted by the thought of dying but by the possibility of living again, even if briefly. He realized that perhaps the worst part of dying wasn't death itself. It was the loneliness that came before it. But maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to face it alone. The night she came back into his life. The following evening, the city wore its usual coat of gold and silver, the twilight sun reflecting against glass towers that glimmered like promises of a world that never slept. Ethan stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, the same view that once made him feel invincible now, only reminding him of how fragile everything truly was. He had ordered his assistant to cancel all meetings for the week, disconnected his phone, and left the endless stream of corporate emails unread. For the first time in 10 years, he was not a CEO, not a visionary, not the man who could solve anything with logic and precision. He was simply a man waiting for a friend who had once known his heart better than he did himself. The silence in the apartment was almost unbearable. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional sound of traffic far below, and the uneven rhythm of his own breathing filled the vast emptiness around him. He felt the weight of the diagnosis pressing on his chest again, but tonight, there was a flicker of something new mixed with the dread. Anticipation. Fragile and terrifying. When the doorbell finally rang, it startled him more than it should have. He hesitated for a second, his pulse quickening as he crossed the marble floor to the door. When he opened it, Lila stood there, framed in the warm hallway light, holding a canvas tucked beneath her arm and a small brown paper bag in her hand. She looked effortlessly graceful, as if she belonged not in his sterile modern apartment, but in some sunlit corner of an art studio surrounded by brushes and half-finished dreams. Her soft smile reached her eyes as she said, "You didn't think I'd let you starve, did you?" Ethan's lips curved into a genuine smile for the first time in months. "I'm not sure I remember how to eat anything that doesn't come from a delivery app." She stepped inside, her presence filling the space with a quiet warmth that made the air feel alive again. They settled into the living room, and Lila unpacked the food: homemade soup, freshly baked bread, and a slice of apple pie that looked imperfect and beautiful in a way no restaurant dessert ever could. Ethan hadn't realized how hungry he was until the smell hit him, and the first spoonful nearly brought tears to his eyes. "You still cook like your mom," he said softly, his voice thick with nostalgia. "I should hope so," she laughed. "Otherwise, all those years she tried to teach me would have been for nothing." For a while, they simply ate in silence, the kind of silence that was comfortable, the kind that existed only between people who had shared years of unspoken understanding. When the meal was done, Lila rose and unwrapped the canvas she had brought. It was a painting, soft strokes of deep blue and pale gold, the kind of abstract that didn't reveal its subject right away, but pulled you into its emotion instead. "It's called Still Here," she said, setting it on the coffee table. Ethan stared at it for a long time, trying to decipher the image. It looked like a storm, fierce and chaotic, but in the middle of it was a single patch of calm light. "That's beautiful," he whispered. "It looks like the eye of a hurricane." Lila nodded slowly. "That's what you were to me once. You were the storm that forced me to paint. But now I think, maybe you're also the calm in the middle of it." Her words hit him with unexpected force, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Ethan had always thought strength meant control, dominating markets, managing people, bending circumstances to his will. But as he looked at her, he realized that true strength was something gentler. It was Lila standing there, unafraid to confront what life had taken from her and what it might still take away. She had been the girl who once cried when he left town and the woman who still found beauty in brokenness. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly, though his eyes betrayed the opposite. "I didn't want you to see me like this." Lila tilted her head, her voice soft but unwavering. "You mean alive?" He blinked. "Barely. Barely is still something, Ethan," she said. "And until it isn't, you don't get to hide." They moved to the balcony, where the cool night air swept through the city and the horizon pulsed with distant lights. Below them, Manhattan stretched endlessly, a sea of lives and stories unfolding. Ethan leaned against the railing, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the skyline. "You ever think about how many people we pass every day?" he asked. "All those faces, all those souls, each one carrying their own little world, and we barely look up." Lila wrapped her arms around herself, watching him carefully. "You used to look up," she said. "When we were kids, you said the stars made you feel small in a good way. You said it reminded you that you didn't have to carry the universe alone." Ethan smiled faintly at the memory. "I said a lot of things back then. I thought the stars would wait for me." "They still do," Lila whispered. "You just stopped looking." The conversation faded into silence again, the kind that wasn't empty but heavy with everything left unsaid. The city below buzzed like static. But up here, the world felt still. Ethan could feel her presence beside him, steady and grounding. For the first time since his diagnosis, the panic that had gripped his mind loosened its hold. "I'm scared," he confessed suddenly, his voice barely audible. "Not of dying, but of being forgotten, of everything I've done amounting to nothing." Lila didn't look at him. Instead, she kept her gaze on the skyline. "You won't be forgotten," she said softly. "The people you helped, the lives you changed, those don't disappear. And even if all of that did vanish, you'd still matter to me. You always did, Ethan, even when you were too blind to see it." He turned toward her then, his throat tight. "Why?" he asked. "After all this time, after I left, after I broke your heart, why do you still care?" She met his gaze, and the honesty in her eyes disarmed him completely. "Because I learned that love isn't about deserving," she said. "It's about remembering who someone really is beneath all the noise. You were lost, Ethan, but I never stopped believing you'd find your way back." Her words tore through every wall he had built, every layer of pride and guilt that had kept him apart from her and from himself. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything his lips couldn't. The hours drifted by like minutes. They talked about their teenage years, about the small town they had left behind, about his inventions and her art, about regrets that lingered like ghosts. Ethan listened to her stories, realizing how much of her life he had missed, how many exhibitions she had painted for, how she had used her art to teach underprivileged children to express what words couldn't. The world she had built was quiet but full, rich in ways his billions could never replicate. When he told her this, she smiled and said, "You built miracles with machines, Ethan. I just painted feelings. Both matter. Both are pieces of the same truth." Sometime after midnight, the conversation slowed, and the fatigue in Ethan's body began to surface. He felt his energy fading, but his spirit was strangely at peace. "Stay," he said softly, almost afraid of his own voice. "Just for a while." Lila hesitated, reading the vulnerability behind the request, then nodded. She sat beside him on the couch as the city lights cast moving patterns across their faces. Neither spoke. The night wrapped around them like a gentle cloak, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt safe. He realized that this quiet companionship, this acceptance, was the night of his life. It wasn't wild or passionate or dramatic. It was simply real. As his eyelids grew heavy, Ethan whispered, "If this is all I have left, I think I can live with that." Lila looked at him, her expression soft and luminous. "Don't talk like it's over," she said. "There's still tomorrow, and maybe another tomorrow after that. Let's take them one at a time." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. It was a small gesture, but to Ethan it felt like salvation. When dawn finally crept across the horizon, painting the city in hues of pink and gold, Ethan opened his eyes to find Lila still there, watching the sunrise beside him. For the first time in months, he smiled without forcing it. The fear hadn't vanished, but something far greater had taken its place, hope. And as the first light touched his face, Ethan knew that no matter what the doctors said, something in him had begun to heal. The promise. Beneath the morning light. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of Ethan's penthouse, painting the room with soft gold. The city was waking beneath them. Taxis honking, engines humming, pedestrians weaving their morning patterns. But inside that apartment, time felt suspended. Ethan sat in silence, his fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, while Lila moved quietly through the kitchen, humming under her breath as she tidied up the remains of breakfast. The smell of toast and brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with something far more intangible, a peace he hadn't felt in years. Watching her now, bathed in light, he couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong to this world of glass and steel. She belonged to the calm places in memory, to the summers of their youth when the world had felt infinite and kind. He couldn't stop thinking about the night before, about how she had stayed, without hesitation, without question. For years, he had lived among people who measured worth in contracts, profits, and power. Yet here she was, bringing warmth to a place that had never truly been a home. "You're quiet," she said finally, glancing over her shoulder. "Too quiet. That's not the Ethan I remember." He smiled faintly, his voice low and rough. That Ethan was reckless and stubborn. "I think he burned out somewhere between a board meeting and an MRI scan." She turned fully, her expression softening. "No, he's still here. Just buried under too much noise. You always try to outthink your heart. Maybe it's time you let it win once." Ethan looked down at his trembling hands and exhaled. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," she admitted. "But the hardest things are often the most important." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the silence charged not with awkwardness, but with shared understanding. Lila set the dish rag down and crossed the room, sitting opposite him at the table. "Tell me something," she said softly. "When did you stop believing you were allowed to be loved?" The question hit him like a quiet thunderclap. His lips parted, but no words came. After a long pause, he said, "When my father died, he always told me love was a distraction, that I needed to focus on building something lasting, something that would outlive me. I spent my whole life chasing that idea, and now that I'm dying, all I've built feels hollow." Lila reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was gentle but grounding, steady like the earth itself. "Your father was wrong," she said softly. "Legacy isn't built in stone or steel or algorithms. It's built in hearts. The people you touch, that's what remains." Ethan closed his eyes as a tear slipped down his cheek, unbidden and raw. "You always say things like that, and somehow they make sense when you say them." She smiled. "Because you always listened, even when you pretended not to." The day unfolded slowly. They left the apartment and walked along the riverside promenade where the Hudson shimmered beneath the spring sun. The breeze was cool, carrying the scent of water and faint traces of cherry blossoms from the park nearby. Lila's hair danced in the wind, and Ethan found himself memorizing the moment, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way the sunlight played on her skin. For hours, they talked like they used to, without filters or facades. They spoke of books they loved, of music that still made them cry, of the fears they never admitted to anyone else. For Ethan, it felt like rediscovering a language he had forgotten, one made not of logic but of emotion. At one point, they stopped at a small bench overlooking the river. Ethan leaned back, exhausted but content, while Lila sketched the water with a small graphite pencil she always seemed to carry. "You still draw," he said quietly. She nodded, not looking up. "Always. It helps me remember that the world is still worth noticing." He watched the lines taking shape on the paper, the curve of the bridge, the outline of the skyline, and realized she wasn't just drawing what she saw. She was capturing what it felt like. "You make it look alive," he said softly. "Because it is," she replied. "Even the still parts." As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Ethan's strength began to wane. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and whispered, "Lila, what if this is all I get? What if I don't make it to another spring?" She stopped sketching and turned toward him. "Then we make this one count," she said. "We stop waiting for the future and start living what's left." Her words carried no pity, only conviction. "You're not dying, Ethan," she continued. "You're still breathing. You're still here. Don't let fear write your last chapter." That evening, they returned to his apartment as the sky turned violet and gold. Lila made tea while Ethan rested on the couch, his body betraying him more each day. When she brought him a cup, he reached out and caught her wrist. "Stay tonight," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "Not because I'm sick. Because I'm finally starting to feel alive, and I don't want it to end yet." Lila hesitated, her heart caught between compassion and something deeper that scared her. But then she nodded, setting the tea aside. "All right," she whispered. "But only if you promise something." "Anything," he said. "Promise me you'll fight. Promise me you'll stop waiting for the end and start choosing the moments that make you forget it." Ethan looked at her, his eyes tired but full of something new. Hope. "I promise," he said. And in that moment, it wasn't a weak man speaking to a friend. It was a man rediscovering purpose. The night deepened around them. They sat together on the balcony, wrapped in blankets, watching the constellations pierce the velvet sky. Ethan found himself telling her everything he had never told anyone. The loneliness of success, the guilt of leaving her, the fear of vanishing without meaning. Lila listened without interrupting, her presence more healing than words. When he fell silent, she turned to him and said, "You've spent your life chasing immortality through invention. But the only immortality that matters is love, the kind that leaves a mark no illness can erase." Hours later, when sleep finally claimed him, Ethan dreamed not of hospitals or pain, but of laughter, sunlight, and the smell of paint. He dreamed of her. And when he woke just before dawn, he found her still there beside him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, her sketchbook open on her lap. The pages were filled with quick drawings. Him laughing, the city skyline, the rising moon. He touched one page gently, tracing the lines. "You stayed," he whispered. Lila stirred, smiling faintly. "I told you," she murmured, half asleep. "I'm not going anywhere." That morning, as sunlight returned to the world, Ethan realized something profound. The tumor inside him was still there. The pain still waited. But for the first time since his diagnosis, he wasn't counting days. He was living them. In her quiet presence, he had found what medicine couldn't offer: peace. And as he looked at her sleeping beside him, he made a silent vow that whatever time he had left, he would spend it not in fear, but in gratitude. He would make her proud. He would make himself human again. The night he remembered how to live. The following days unfolded like something out of a forgotten dream. Ethan woke each morning with the quiet hum of the city below. But now, instead of bitterness or dread, there was a fragile pulse of purpose beating in his chest. The sickness was still there, its weight, its fatigue, its cruel reminders. But so was Lila. She had begun visiting daily, sometimes bringing sketches, sometimes bringing meals she cooked herself, but always bringing light. Her laughter drifted through his apartment like the echo of a home he never knew he needed, and with each passing hour, the grayness that had surrounded his soul began to fade. He found himself noticing things he hadn't in years: the way sunlight slid through his blinds in soft ribbons, the delicate bloom of spring flowers on the terrace, the scent of rain when the wind turned. He had lived so long in the noise of ambition that he had forgotten how silence could feel like music. Lila, ever patient, never spoke of the illness directly. She refused to treat him as a dying man, even when the evidence was written across his face. Instead, she spoke of life, of small joys and quiet miracles. She told him about her art classes for children, about how a boy who had lost his parents had painted the stars because, as he put it, they're the only thing that doesn't leave. She spoke of her garden on the rooftop of her apartment, where wildflowers bloomed in rebellion against the concrete city. "Everything that grows," she said one afternoon as she painted by the window, "is a kind of miracle. You just have to give it the chance." Ethan watched her then, her brush gliding across the canvas, her brow furrowed in focus. For the first time, he realized that she wasn't just painting colors. She was painting truth. One evening, after a particularly exhausting round of treatments that left his body weak and trembling, Ethan asked her to take him somewhere, anywhere that wasn't another room filled with doctors or machines. Lila hesitated, unsure whether he was strong enough, but his insistence was quiet and resolute. "I don't want to die in rooms that smell like antiseptic," he said softly. "I want to remember what life feels like. One more time." So that night, just as the city lights flickered on, she helped him into his coat, her hands steady and gentle, and they left the tower of glass and marble behind. The drive was long, winding through highways that grew emptier the farther they went. The neon glow of the city faded into the dark comfort of open fields and scattered lights in the distance. Ethan leaned against the window, his breath fogging the glass. And for a moment, he could almost imagine he was 17 again, driving away from Brenton Bay to chase the future that had seemed infinite back then. After nearly 2 hours, Lila turned off the road and parked by the edge of a quiet lake. The water stretched before them, calm and silver beneath the moonlight. Fireflies drifted in lazy circles along the shore, and the faint whisper of wind through reeds carried the scent of earth and rain. Ethan's chest tightened, not from pain, but from the sheer beauty of it all. "This place," he murmured, his voice trembling. "It's where we used to come when we were kids." Lila smiled, her eyes glistening. "You remembered." "Of course I did," he whispered. "You said this lake held secrets, that it only told them to people who listened." She laughed softly. "And you said secrets were for poets, not scientists." "I was an idiot. You were young, and you were too good for me," he said, his tone somewhere between apology and awe. They stepped out of the car and walked toward the water, Lila's arm steadying him as they went. The night was cool but not cold, the air soft against their skin. The moon hung low, reflecting on the lake like a second sky. Ethan stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, letting the silence wash over him. He had spent his entire life surrounded by sound, by technology, by noise, by endless motion, but this silence was the loudest thing he had ever heard. "I forgot how to breathe like this," he said finally. Lila looked at him, her expression tender. "That's what the world does when we stop paying attention. It keeps breathing for us, waiting for us to remember." For a long time, neither spoke. Then, slowly, Lila reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "Do you remember this?" she asked, handing it to him. Ethan unfolded it carefully, his fingers trembling. It was a letter, his handwriting, written in the messy scrawl of a 17-year-old boy. "To Lila Hayes," it began. "If I ever make it, I'll come back for you. And if I don't, I hope you'll paint the stars for me." His throat tightened. He had written it the night before he left for college, but he had never given it to her. "How did you—" "Your mother found it years later," Lila said softly. "She gave it to me when she got sick. She said you'd forgotten who you were, but maybe I could help you remember." Tears welled in his eyes, and he lowered his head, the paper trembling in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said. "For leaving, for forgetting, for everything." Lila stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to apologize anymore, Ethan. You came back. That's enough." He looked at her then, and something inside him broke open, a dam that had held back years of guilt, loneliness, and fear. He wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small. Instead, he took her hand and held it against his heart. "You saved me," he said quietly. "You remind me what being alive feels like." They sat by the lake for hours, the world shrinking to the soft rhythm of water lapping against the shore and the quiet beating of two hearts learning to move in unison again. Lila spoke of faith, not in religion, but in love, in resilience, in the human spirit's ability to endure. "You think your story ends when you die," she said. "But that's not true. It ends when you stop giving something to the world, and you still have more to give." Ethan listened, her words carving themselves into his soul. He realized that she wasn't giving him hope. She was teaching him how to make it. When dawn began to break, streaking the horizon with bands of pink and gold, Lila wrapped her scarf around his neck and whispered, "Let's go home." But Ethan shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Let's stay a little longer. I want to remember this light." And so they did. Two silhouettes against the rising sun, holding hands like the world had stopped turning. That morning changed something irreversible inside him. The fear that had defined him began to dissolve, replaced by an understanding that went beyond survival. It wasn't about how long he had left, it was about what he did with it. For the first time, Ethan began writing again, scribbling thoughts and ideas in a leather notebook Lila had given him. He wrote about the beauty of impermanence, about love's quiet endurance, about how some lives burn briefly but brightly enough to light others forever. Weeks passed, and though his body weakened, his spirit strengthened. The doctors were astonished. His scans showed unexpected stability, his symptoms eased. But Ethan knew the truth. Medicine had given him time, but love had given him life. And every evening, as he watched the sunset with Lila by his side, he felt it, the heartbeat of a man who had once been lost but was now, finally, found. The night the stars remembered his name. The summer drifted in softly, almost shyly, as if the world itself was holding its breath for Ethan. The city outside his windows shimmered in warm light, and the hum of life pulsed in the streets below like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Inside the apartment, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and paint. Lila had moved some of her canvases there, turning one corner of the vast penthouse into a miniature studio where color bloomed across blank surfaces. The space had transformed from a museum of wealth into a sanctuary of humanity. Ethan often watched her work from his armchair, her fingers stained with pigments, her hair tied loosely, a few strands always escaping to brush against her cheek. Each stroke of her brush seemed to breathe life back into him. The doctors continued to monitor him with cautious optimism. His tumor had not disappeared, but something inexplicable had changed. His pain came less frequently, and his eyes, once dulled by resignation, now shone with quiet fire. The medical community called it an anomaly. Ethan called it grace. He had begun documenting his thoughts in a notebook that he kept on the small table beside his chair, writing letters he would never send and philosophies no one had asked for. He wrote about second chances, about how death was not the opposite of life but its mirror, reflecting what truly mattered. He wrote about Lila, how her presence had rewritten every definition of strength he had ever known. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the glass and caught the golden threads of her hair, Lila looked up from her easel and smiled. "You're writing again," she said softly. "That means you're living again." Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting to the skyline. "I used to think living meant building things that would outlast me. But now I think it just means being brave enough to love something without knowing how long you have." Lila put her brush down and came to sit beside him. "That's what art is," she said. "You paint knowing the colors will fade someday, but you paint anyway." The weeks that followed became a symphony of small moments, each one luminous in its simplicity. They cooked together, laughed at old jokes that had outlived their youth, watched movies until dawn, and sometimes sat in silence, content just to exist in the same space. Yet beneath the laughter and the fragile peace, Ethan could feel his strength slipping. He hid it well, or so he thought, until one evening when Lila found him in the kitchen, bracing himself against the counter, his breath shallow and his face pale. She rushed to his side, but he shook his head gently. "It's just the world reminding me it's still in charge," he whispered. She wanted to cry, but instead she smiled, because she knew he didn't need pity, he needed presence. She took his hand and said softly, "Then let's remind it that we are too." That night they went to the roof. The city stretched endlessly beneath them, an ocean of lights, and above it all the stars shimmered faintly against the dark velvet of the sky. The same stars they had watched as children from the fields of Brenton Bay. The same stars that had witnessed every promise, every silence, every return. Ethan lay back on a blanket Lila had brought, his head resting on her lap. She traced gentle circles on his temple with her fingertips, and for a long while, neither spoke. The world below them roared with motion, but here, there was only stillness. "Do you ever wonder," he said finally, "what it all means? All of this, the stars, the love, the pain?" Lila smiled faintly. "I think meaning isn't something we find," she said. "It's something we make, like art, like forgiveness." He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers. "Then thank you," he whispered, "for helping me make mine." She shook her head. "You did it yourself. I just reminded you where the light was." His breathing grew uneven, and for a moment fear flickered across her eyes. But Ethan's expression was peaceful. "Do you remember what you said when we were kids?" he asked weakly. "That stars were the souls of people who loved too brightly to disappear?" Lila nodded, her throat tightening. "I still believe that." "Then promise me," he said, "that when you see them, you'll think of me as one of them." Her tears fell silently, glimmering under the moonlight. I don't need to look up to find you, Ethan, she whispered. You're already here. Hours passed in quiet companionship. The city thinned to silence, and dawn crept slowly into the horizon, washing the sky with shades of pink and silver. Ethan's hand, still clasped in hers, grew cold, his breathing slowed, and before the sun had fully risen, the world lost a man who had finally learned what it meant to live. Lila didn't cry out. She simply sat there, her fingers still tracing his hair, her heart breaking not from loss, but from the unbearable beauty of what they had shared. When the first rays of sunlight touched his face, she leaned down and whispered, "Rest now. You kept your promise. You came back." Days later, the world mourned him as the brilliant mind who had changed technology forever. News outlets flooded with tributes. Old colleagues called him a visionary, a genius, a pioneer. But Lila knew the truth behind the headlines, that Ethan Cole's greatest invention wasn't the neural chip or the empire he built. It was the life he rediscovered, the love he learned to give freely, the hope he left in the hearts of everyone he touched. His final notebook became a legacy of its own, a book she later published under his name titled The Art of Breathing, filled with his reflections on courage, compassion, and rebirth. It became a beacon for people who had forgotten how to begin again. A year later, on the anniversary of his passing, Lila returned to the lake where they had once sat beneath the stars. The air was warm and the water shimmered like glass. She carried a small box with her, a collection of his letters, a few sketches she had made of him, and the ring he had once told her he wished he'd given her long ago. Kneeling by the water's edge, she whispered, "You were right. Meaning is what we make of the time we have. And you filled mine completely." Then she opened the box and released its contents into the lake. The letters drifted across the surface before sinking slowly, carried away by the current, merging into something infinite. That night, back in her apartment, Lila stood by her window, the city lights flickering below. She looked up at the sky, and for the first time in months, she saw a shooting star cut across the heavens. It was quick, brilliant, and gone in an instant, but it left behind a trail that lingered like a memory. She smiled through her tears. "Good night, Ethan," she whispered. "You finally found your forever." And in that quiet moment, the stars above Brenton Bay shimmered just a little brighter, as if they too remembered his name.